At issue this week, Bicentennial memories. As America gets set to celebrate its 250th anniversary, we look back at the last milestone birthday bash the city hosted. We're talking to someone who had a front row seat 50 years ago. Plus, documenting history. We're looking at the preserved papers that show what sparked the American Revolution and the key role Philadelphia played. And Let Freedom Ring, the art project that's bringing a symbol of liberty to neighborhoods across our area.
NBC10 At Issue starts now.
I'm Lauren Mayk. Welcome to NBC10 At Issue. America is getting ready to celebrate a big milestone birthday, our nation's 250th. And Philadelphia is right in the middle of it. But this is not the first time the city of brotherly love has thrown a big birthday bash. The last big landmark birthday celebration for the nation was the Bicentennial in 1976. That year, the city hosted a massive parade on the Ben Franklin Parkway, and special visitors came to town, including then President Gerald Ford and Queen Elizabeth II and her husband, Prince Philip. Joining us now is a man who covered those bicentennial celebrations in 1976, former NBC 10 reporter and anchor Terry Ruggles. Terry, it's so great to see you.
Lauren, always good to see you.
So let's talk about what you experienced then and kind of give people some perspective as we're going through all of this now. As you see these preparations happening for the 250th, how does it compare to what was happening in the city around this time in 1976, that sort of buildup?
You know, if you think back, in 1976, there were no cell phones. Cable was in its infancy. There was no streaming of any kind. So 3, 6, and 10 were the big dogs in town as far as getting the information out. So we were kind of the center of attention because we were the visual conduit for what was going on. And the whole country was playing Philadelphia that year. There was a wagon train that started in Washington State, and it split up and still moved east, and it went through towns, and they would all celebrate the Bicentennial with this wagon train going through these towns, and the destination was Philadelphia. So all summer long, this drum beat kept thumping about Philadelphia, Philadelphia, Philadelphia. So we were in the national spotlight.
Are there moments that stick with you from that year, from that celebration? Things that sort of stick out to you as symbols of that celebration?
Two that come to mind immediately is right around Independence Hall, and quite frankly, in many places in Center City. There were fifes and drums and people in period clothing. There were grenadine people on horseback, you know, Revolutionary grenadine soldiers. And there was just this feel all the time, about 2 weeks leading in and about 2 weeks after, that Philadelphia was back in time. The other thing that is a story that I covered was General Washington sent General Mad Anthony Wayne to New Jersey to get beef to drive to Valley Forge to feed the troops. Okay, that's the background. So a guy by the name of Stoney Harris in Cowtown in Salem County got together 50 head of cattle and recreated this cattle drive up Kings Highway, up north to Trenton, and across the river to Valley Forge. It was just really weird seeing cattle go through Haddonfield, New Jersey.
Yeah. And, you know, so much of this particular celebration has been geared toward people being in Philadelphia, coming to Philadelphia, the All-Star Game coming here, FIFA being here, PGA being here. Was that a focus back then in terms of the tourism and getting people to be here to experience it?
Well, I think you bring up a good point for this reason, is there's a lot of, I don't want to call it noise, but there are a lot of other big name distractions going on now, just the things that you just went over. Back in 1976, we didn't have that, but we had an undercurrent. For example, Frank Rizzo was worried about hippies, he called them, making big protests in the city. So he asked the federal government to send in 15,000 troops. That didn't happen. They were worried about millions of people coming to Philadelphia. Another segment of the city was worried about not enough toilets. So they were worried about Jobtown John's, and you would go to restaurants and you would see signs on the windows of no public restrooms kind of thing. There were different things, but we had President Ford came to town. Queen Elizabeth came to town on the 6th of July, and that was a big deal too. And how ironic, everybody's kind of snickering. Oh, we kicked the British out before, and they've come back to see us again. And just a lot of dignitaries came in, and there were street bands everywhere too. People playing fifes and drums, or people playing banjos and that kind of thing. It was just a fun, festive feel in the city.
Yeah, I know that now, as we are celebrating this 250th, there's also conversations about the government as it is today, and there are divisions in this country right now. What was the environment at that moment, and were those? Tell me about what the conversations were happening.
Good question. And when you think back, the Vietnam War ended in 1973, but the troops actually finally left in April of 1975. So the Vietnam War and the anti-government sentiment was still ripe in the area. And that's one of the reasons that Frank Rizzo had asked for troops to come in and protect the city. So there was still what I would call an undercurrent, or a segment of the population that was anti-government because of what the government had been doing militarily. There wasn't as much polarization, red versus blue, but there was this anti-war wave that was still going on, even though the war was over.
When the events and the celebrations wrapped up, is there anything that you felt was a lasting impact on the city that changed the city in some way?
Well, good question, and I think they were disappointed. You know how when a city gets the Olympics, they think they're going to have all these stadiums built and hotels are going to turn into dormitories for colleges. There was some hope that would happen here. They were talking about literally 100 million people coming through in a year. That didn't happen. I think we got about 20 million people over the year for it, and concentrated a few million during the 4th of July week. So what they were hoping for economically didn't happen. There was a big economic push up during the Bicentennial, and then it just went back down to business as usual.
You got to be right in the middle of it. It was that was an honor that not a lot of people get. I think we as reporters, we do try to sometimes take a moment in these big stories and remind ourselves that we're witnessing history.
And I think that's one of the reasons that you and I are journalists.
All right, we'll leave it there. Former NBC 10 reporter and anchor Terry Ruggles, thanks so much for joining us. Great to see you.
Great seeing you, Lauren. Great seeing you.
Still ahead, historic papers, the rare documents on display this year that show how the American Revolution unfolded and the key role Philadelphia played.
This is NBC 10 at Issue.
In honor of America's 250th birthday, the Historical Society of Pennsylvania is putting rare documents on display. It's part of an exhibit that tells the story of how protests against British rule grew over more than a decade, culminating in a full-blown rebellion. I recently took a guided tour of their ongoing exhibit called Paths to Independence, 1765 to 1787. It focuses on the decade before and the decade after the Revolution. Librarian and CEO David Brigham walked me through it.
So the exhibition begins here, Lauren, and this case really focuses on 1765 and 1766. In the spring of 65, Parliament passes a law that's known to us as the Stamp Act, and it imposed taxes on legal documents, newspapers, diplomas, things of that nature, and they had to be stamped. And I've actually got 2 stamps here that have survived for these 270 years since this happened. The Stamp Act set in motion a cycle of activities, tax, protest, repeal, and that continues. But in the early 70s, it accelerates. These things are happening faster, and violence happens. So this first image is Paul Revere's depiction of the Boston Massacre, where the Standing Army of England was confronted by a group of protesters. Words were exchanged, snowballs were thrown. This was early March of 1770, and the soldiers opened fire, and they killed a number of men. And all of a sudden, this goes from words to violence, physical violence, where the representatives of the British government are firing among the American people. It completely changes the tenor of this series of controversies.
This is a turning point in
it's
the
a turning point. And then this is another, sort of raising the stakes moment. This is a representation, it's a political cartoon responding to the Boston Tea Party. So England imposes a tea tax. The colonies respond by, again, embargoing tea. They say they won't import any tea. And a group of sort of radical patriots in Boston throw literally tons of tea into the Boston Harbor, destroying what in our dollars is millions of dollars worth of product by throwing it into the Boston Harbor. Interestingly, we all grew up learning about the Boston Tea Party, but there were tea protests in all the port cities up and down the Atlantic. So over here, we have information about how Philadelphia responded to this same tea tax. And what happened in Philadelphia, and it actually happened slightly before the Boston Tea Party, much less famous, but in Philadelphia, the citizens gathered, they had public meetings, and they decided that they would not permit any ships carrying tea to come into port in Philadelphia. So in Boston, they destroy the tea. In Philadelphia, they simply say you can't land. So it's very—
And they're effective.
And they're effective, And the difference, however, is that, England really doesn't have a lot to say about the Philadelphia protest. For Boston, they impose even tighter restrictions by shutting down the port. And that creates a crisis up and down the Atlantic coast, which leads to the convening of the First Continental Congress right here in Philadelphia. In 1775, we have the Battle of Lexington and Concord, again in Massachusetts, but this leads to the Second Continental Congress, and at that Congress, two important resolutions and documents are produced. This is one. It's the Declaration of the Colonies. The United Colonies of North America now met in General Congress at Philadelphia, setting forth the causes and necessity of their taking up arms. This is a very radical document because it's saying that the colonies are under threat by their own government. Great Britain is their governing authority. There are provincial legislatures. Pennsylvania has a provincial assembly, but their government is Great Britain in many ways, and they're warning Great Britain that they now have the right to arm themselves, to protect themselves against the standing army of England. And this is not received well. When the king receives this, he declares that the colonies are in open rebellion. The other document that's produced nearly simultaneously is this document written by John Dickinson, who's one of the delegates to the Congress, and it's called the Olive Branch Petition, and it's a last-ditch effort to try to accommodate and find reconciliation between the colonies and England. In addition to the Olive Branch Petition, two other really important documents. The first one is Thomas Paine's pamphlet called Common Sense. And Common Sense is published in January of 1776, when many Americans have not yet reached the idea that we need to declare independence. It's an uncomfortable idea. It's basically turning our world upside down. And a lot of people aren't ready to do that. And Thomas Paine writes that we have no choice, that England continues to oppress us. They call themselves the mother country, but mothers don't devour their children. So that's the language he uses. The Boston Massacre, the Battle of Lexington and Concord killed people here in the colonies. And Paine says mothers don't devour their children. And he uses other kinds of logic and arguments like that. to really urge, and we pulled this quote out from the pamphlet, "The time hath found us." Some people at the time would say, well, eventually we will mature and we'll need to be independent. But now is not the time. We're not ready. Our economy's not strong enough. We don't really have a government. What would we do? You know, there's a bit of hand-wringing. And Paine says, no, the time is now. Fate has brought us to this point, and there's no turning back. There's no reconciliation after armed conflict. The only solution is for us to declare ourselves independent of Great Britain. So that takes us to the Declaration of Independence. And this is a unique printing of the Declaration. It's printed right in the moment. The printer's name is John Dunlap. He's a newspaper publisher, and he is the official printer to the Continental Congress. And he is called upon to typeset the approved text of the Declaration of Independence, which is written under the direction of a committee of five, and Jefferson, among those five, is the primary author of the Declaration of Independence. So this is Jefferson's text. We all know it. We studied it in school. We're most familiar with the two first paragraphs, which say things like, you know, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. It establishes universal human rights. It says that we have a right to government by consent, that government shouldn't be imposed on us, but we get to elect our representative government, and we get to decide when that government is working for us and not working for us. So these are big ideas. These are the ideas, you know, these are the ideals that we were taught, that all men are created equal, and that means all men and women. So this is the idea of, you know, universal rights. This, I mentioned, is a unique copy. We call it a printer's proof, and we think it's printed literally hours before this thing goes to press. And what's different about it is that when we look at phrases like that all men are created equal, it's contained in quotation marks, and that's not part of the final text. Jefferson would mark up his speeches with quotation marks when he was getting to read them out loud. So we can imagine, we don't know for sure, because he didn't write this down, but what we know about his other written documents that were spoken, he would use quotation marks to pace himself. You and I might use bold text or all caps or a font shift to know when to emphasize. So they're basically breathing marks, and they're telling him what to emphasize. He knows this text inside and out, but he's preparing to read this out loud. As far as we know, he never did that with the Declaration, but that's why those quotation marks are there.
That was just part of my tour of the exhibit at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. There's much more to the exhibit that focuses on the decade after the Revolution. The Historical Society of Pennsylvania is located at 13th and Locust, and they have a full calendar of exhibits scheduled in honor of America's 250th birthday. For more information, go to NBC10.com/finditon10. Birthday bells. You might have seen these Liberty Bell replicas popping up in neighborhoods around the city. Ahead, a closer look at the stories and artists behind them.
This is NBC10 At Issue.
Excitement is building in all corners of Philadelphia as we get closer to America's 250th birthday. But you don't have to wait until July 4th to see and feel the celebration. NBC10's Katie Zachary shows us how it has already begun in many parts of the city.
In the heart of West Oak Lane sits a work of art that's catching a lot of extra eyes.
What do you think about this bell?
This bell is very, very nice.
Everybody wants a bell. Like as soon as people start hearing about the bells, they're like, wait a minute, I want a bell. How do we get a bell?
Catherine Ottlevel heads the Philadelphia Visitor Center and Philadelphia 250. She says nearly 24 other Liberty Bell-like replicas dot local neighborhoods, spots chosen by the mayor's office, Commerce Department, and City Council.
We paired with mural arts and artists to work with that community to think about what do they want portrayed on the bell.
There's a great story behind the bell here in West Oak Lane. The artist who did it does not live here, but she visited this community about 20 times to get an idea of what to put on it. Everything from the books to the musical instruments to the family portraits. It's all reflective of the people who live here.
This is something what we want to share, right, as Asian people, Asian artists.
Artistic duo Chen-Lin Chai and his wife painted the Chinatown bell that sits in the plaza at 10th and Vine Streets. Every element, from the horse representing the Chinese Year of the Horse to Chinatown's famed gate at 10th and Arch Streets, to the color of the dad's shirt.
The father's clothes, right, the green, I want to find something connecting to the Philadelphia, so it's kind of from the eagle, like a jersey.
The Chinese candy in hand and the tiger hat on the boy's head.
Kids wearing this kind of hat can pray for, like, wish for, like, longevity and healthy. So it's kind of, longevity for this country as well.
In Chinatown, Katie Zachary, NBC 10 News.
This is NBC 10 At Issue.
We're back now to wrap up this edition of NBC 10 At Issue. Today we looked back at the Bicentennial celebrations 50 years ago and looked ahead to the 250th celebrations in the coming days. There is a full slate of special events happening around our area to celebrate this major milestone in America's history. You can read more about it on NBC10.com and the free NBC 10 app. Just click on the R250 tab to find more information about the major events planned for this year. That does it for this edition of NBC 10 At Issue. Thanks for joining us. Have a great day.